My Govanen. Welcome to the Tolkien Lore channel. I'm the Tolkien Geek, and in this video, I'm going to be talking about some pretty big news that's just come out recently in the Tolkien world about the upcoming release of Beren and Luthien. It's a book that's going to be released in May 2017, at least according to current news, and it's going to be about one of the central stories in the Silmarillion, which has importance much beyond the Silmarillion, including into the Lord of the Rings. And so in this video, I thought it was a good opportunity to kind of talk about the importance of the Beren and Luthien story, kind of give a little bit of background for those who aren't familiar with the Silmarillion and the story itself, and then kind of get into what I'm hoping to get out of the book and maybe some other related things that might be of interest. So let's get started. Before we get too far, I should say this story does have some serious connections to the Lord of the Rings, and I'm going to touch on some of those. So if you don't want to get spoilers for the story itself or some of the things in the Lord of the Rings that maybe didn't make it to the movies and you haven't read the books, then you might want to tune out now so you don't get spoiled to those. Just wanted to warn you ahead of time. So for those of you not really familiar with the Silmarillion and the Beren and Luthien story, some basic background. The Silmarillion is basically about the quest of the elves to recover 3 jewels called Silmarils from Morgoth, who is essentially Sauron's boss. I mean, if Tolkien's legendarium has a devil, then it's Morgoth. Sauron is actually a lesser evil than Morgoth is. And the story of Beren and Luthien is the story of a man, Beren, and an elf princess, Luthien, who fall in love. Of course, the father of Luthien is not too happy about this situation because Beren is just a man. And men are newcomers, and he's also, this particular elf king is not very fond of outsiders generally anyway. So what he basically does is he gives Beren an impossible task. He says, if you can recover a Silmaril from Morgoth, then you can marry my daughter, knowing full well in his own mind that he can't possibly succeed, and so therefore he's risking nothing. Well, the rest of the story of Beren and Luthien is basically about Beren attempting to retrieve a Silmaril so that he can bring it to the king and therefore win Luthien's hand in marriage. So there's a lot of adventures that happen in the middle of all this. It's a semi-tragic but also semi-comic tale, comic in the traditional sense of happy ending. There's a lot that goes on. I don't want to get into too much of the story for those of you who haven't read it, because I don't want to spoil it. It's very much worth reading in its own right. But it's an interesting story in terms of Tolkien's legendarium because it has very far-reaching impacts beyond its own story. If you've seen my video on the story of Kullervo, which is about an old Finnish folk tale which Tolkien kind of used as inspiration for another Silmarillion story, the one of Turin Turambar, then that story is a little more self-contained. You can kind of read the story of Turin Turambar, and there's no major effects that story has beyond its own scope. Beren and Luthien is a very different story in that out of Beren and Luthien comes a lot of very important characters. Their descendants play a lot of roles in Tolkien's mythology. One of the key ones being that one of their descendants who inherits the Silmaril that Beren recovers, spoiler alert, one of their descendants named Eärendil, who inherits the Silmaril, ends up being the one to kind of bring the climax to the story of the Silmarillion. He finally gets the Valar involved in the war between the elves and Morgoth, and they finally defeat Morgoth and bring an end to the First Age in the process. Now, some of you may know or be familiar with the name Eärendil because it's the name of the star that from which Galadriel puts the light into the phial that she gives Frodo. And the connection there is that Eärendil actually ends up being put in a ship. Well, it's actually the ship that he himself built, but the Valar essentially make it capable of traveling outside of the normal bounds of the world. He's essentially flying around in space. It's not actually space in the Tolkien mythology. It's a little bit different, obviously, but basically he's flying the ship among the stars, and he himself is a star because the light of the Silmaril is so bright. So that's the light of the phial of Galadriel is the light of the Silmaril that Eärendil inherits ultimately from Beren and Luthien. So you can see there's a lot of interconnectedness already just in those terms. So some other interesting connections that this story has beyond just its own little self-enclosed storyline. Beren and Luthien, of course, is the first story where you get a man marrying an elf. So that's pretty important in terms of setting a precedent. It happens at least once more in the First Age. I won't get into the details on that right now. But of course, it also serves as the model for Aragorn and Arwen marrying in The Lord of the Rings. And another reason that's really important is not just because it serves as a model, but Aragorn and Arwen are actually both descended from Beren and Luthien through Eärendil. Eärendil has two children, Elrond being one of them, and the other being Elros. Elros ends up choosing to be, well, at the end of the Silmarillion, both of these two are given the choice to either live as an elf or live as a man, because they're half-elven, and they're kind of unique in Silmarillion history, and so the Valar basically give them the option, which way do you want to go? Elrond chooses to be an elf, and Elros chooses to be a man. He becomes the first king of Numenor, and of course, Aragorn's lineage comes from Numenor. He's one of the last of the line of the kings of Numenor. And so Aragorn and Arwen are actually very distant cousins. You could probably find out exactly the degree of their relationship if you wanted to look through the genealogies that Tolkien laid out. But the main point is, not only is their relationship modeled after Beren and Luthien's, but they're descendants of Beren and Luthien. And in fact, Arwen is said to be kind of a reincarnation of Luthien in the sense that she resembles her a great deal. So there's a lot of interplay between Beren and Luthien's story and Lord of the Rings. And in fact, at one point in the books, Sam makes a comment to Frodo. They're talking about the phial of Galadriel. They're actually talking about, the way it goes is they're talking about a point in the story earlier where Aragorn had been singing to the hobbits the story of Beren and Luthien, and there's a little bit of hint of this in the movie as well. But Sam is recalling that later on in the story after he and Frodo have left the Fellowship. And it suddenly occurs to him that the phial of Galadriel has the light of the Silmaril that Beren had gotten from Morgoth. And he, this realization kind of comes on him, and he's like, wait a minute, we're still part of the same story. And he basically says, don't the great stories ever end? And of course, it's an interesting tie-in because Tolkien is kind of subtly making a point. The really big stories don't ever end. And this kind of goes back to his Catholic worldview. If you read a lot of what he has to say about fairy stories, if you read his essay on fairy stories, his view is that fairy stories are in some sense kind of all based on the great myth, and that's my term, not his, but the great myth of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus Christ. I mean, that to him, that is the ultimate form of eucatastrophe, which is the term he developed to describe the turn of events in a fairy story that takes you from sorrow to sudden joy. And in his mind, all fairy stories are basically trying to recapture the feeling of the eucatastrophe that is present in the Christian story. And so, much like the Christian story is in one sense one big story of which we're all part in Tolkien's worldview, so Sam and Frodo are still part of a much bigger story in their own world. So there's a huge amount of reasons why the Beren and Luthien story are hugely important in Tolkien's mythology. Now, that being said, I want to get into a few things that I'm hoping to find in the book when it comes out, and we'll see how that turns out when it actually is released and I get a chance to read it. So what am I hoping for when Beren and Luthien comes out next year, this being 2016? Well, I'm hoping primarily for something akin to the Children of Húrin, which was released, I'm trying to remember how many years ago. It's not very old. But the Children of Húrin is essentially Túrin's story told less like it is in the Silmarillion and more like its own standalone novel. So in the Children of Húrin, we get a fuller development of the Túrin Turambar story, and it's in all its variations, and it's kind of collecting all the material that Tolkien wrote and putting it together in the most coherent form possible, given that Christopher Tolkien is working, not with the mind of the author, but with the mind of a collector of documents. So I'm hoping that is also going to happen in Beren and Luthien, because I think the Children of Húrin turned out really well in terms of its narrative style and everything. It very much is reminiscent of Tolkien's style of writing, and it's not just like the Silmarillion, where you kind of get more of a history type style, but it's somewhere in between that and a more traditional narrative style like you get in The Lord of the Rings. One of these days I'll do a review of the Children of Húrin. I just bring it up now as a reference to those who are familiar with it, all those Tolkien geeks out there who've already read that. That's kind of what I'm hoping Beren and Luthien is. I'm also hoping that there's a lot of notes as far as kind of describing the creative process, maybe giving some more insight into where Tolkien got some of his ideas. That's always nice. I don't want that to be a huge amount of the book, because that can kind of take away from the storytelling. And if it is going to be a large part of the book, I hope it's separate. Children of Húrin, I think, did a very good job of keeping the part of the book that is explanatory, to the extent that there is any, very separate from the story itself. In some of the History of Middle-earth series, if you've read those, you'll notice that there's a lot of interspersed commentary. It's not just all the narrative and then some commentary at the end. It kind of gets intermingled, and I hope it ends up being a little more like the Children of Húrin, where you get the narrative by itself, uninterrupted, and therefore much easier to enjoy. With, if there's going to be any commentary, I'd like it to be separate. But I would like there to be some commentary. I just don't want it to be interspersed with the narrative such that it kind of ruins the flow and destroys the power of the narrative itself. And I'm also really hoping that there's some connections between some of Tolkien's earliest writings in the Silmarillion mythology, showing how the development affects his overall view of the mythology. Because Beren and Luthien is a central story to the entire mythology. Obviously, it has huge, wide-ranging impacts that I've talked about just a minute ago. And I'd really like to see, if the information is available, and it may not be, but I'd like to see how the development of the mythology affects their story, and how their story in turn affects the mythology. Because how the importance of the story for the mythology is such that I can't help but think that there probably is a lot of interplay there. So I'm really hoping to see some of that. Beyond that, I really just hope that it comes out on time, and I hope that it comes out in a way that, again, doesn't make the narrative secondary to the explanation. I'm really looking forward to it. Even though it's material I know backward and forward to some extent, I'm really looking forward to a new version, so to speak, that really puts it all together in a narrative form such that you can pick it up, read it on its own without necessarily having to pick up the Silmarillion. And that to me is what makes some of these later releases from Tolkien's, mythology very interesting, is the fact that you can start to kind of introduce yourself to the world of the Silmarillion without necessarily jumping into the Silmarillion itself. So I'm hoping that it leads to a similar type of thing where people who are interested in more of Tolkien's works might be able to pick that up and get a really, enjoyable experience out of the narrative of just this one story without having to face the daunting task, or what may seem like a daunting task, of jumping into the Silmarillion wholesale. Because the Silmarillion is, in some ways, a little bit more difficult to get into than the Lord of the Rings, because it's not the same type of narrative. But I think it is well worth getting into, and so I hope this book, along with The Children of Húrin, will help some people make that leap. They'll read about this story, especially because it has such large connections to The Lord of the Rings. People who know The Lord of the Rings really well will hopefully pick this one up and finally, make that jump into the Silmarillion. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the upcoming release of Beren and Luthien. Unfortunately, that's still about 7 months away. That's a long wait for somebody like me who eagerly awaits any new Tolkien release. Hopefully the rest of you aren't chomping at the bit quite as much as I am. If you've got other thoughts in terms of what you're hoping this book will bring to the table, please comment below. If you like this video, please like the video and share it. Please subscribe as well. And also, if you have any other topics you think would be worth discussing in this series of videos, comment that as well. And until next time, I am the Tolkien Geek signing out for the Tolkien Lore channel. Namarie.